right, well, I think we can get underway here. Thrilled to be with you virtually here today. My name is Claire Voorhees. I'm a Senior Program Officer at the Walton Family Foundation. And our topic today, what brought you here, is the future of testing, predicting the future of testing. And predicting the future, I think today is, particularly right now in these uncertain times, is harder than ever. And that's why I'm really glad we're in the very capable hands of two good friends of mine, Denise Forte of EdTrust and Chad Aldeman of Bellwether. I'll have Chad and Denise introduce themselves a little bit more formally when I throw the first question at them. But a few things to start out. One is just a couple framing comments, and then just an administrative comment. So to frame us today, I think we all know there are a lot of types of testing. Our panel today focuses on perhaps arguably the most important and the most controversial type of testing, which is the annual statewide assessments required by the federal government. And we're at a particularly interesting and challenging time for statewide assessment. The COVID-19 pandemic and the resulting disruptions to public education have, I think, probably created the greatest threat to the future of assessment that we've seen in many years. We see opponents of testing lining up. You see the NEA has come out and said testing should be, asked the Biden administration to do away with testing. You see the Massachusetts Teachers Union call for a 3-year moratorium. So, we're really at a challenging time. At the same time, it's a great opportunity. I think we all know that tests are incredibly important, but there are also some serious weaknesses in the current testing regime. So this moment in our history provides a really important moment to look for the future of testing. I should mention, this spring, the U.S. Department of Education came out a month or so ago and has said that statewide assessments will be given this spring of 2021. They've said states will have flexibility in how that happens, and states will also have flexibility in how the data from them is used. And so today we're going to spend the balance of our conversation not on spring 21, but really looking beyond spring 21 to what the future holds and what we want to see as advocates and policymakers from the future of testing. So on an operational note, everyone has an opinion on this topic. We want to hear a lot from the experts. Also would love to hear questions from the folks in the room. So please put your questions as we go. I'll be monitoring the chat and also the Q&A. So please throw them and I'll take them as they come in or save them for the end as appropriate. So with that, I'm really pleased to turn it over to Chad and Denise, but I'm going to turn it over to them in the form of a question, if they don't mind. We're going to try to keep this very conversational today. And the first is really, before we look to the future, I wanted to take a little bit of a walk down memory lane. Not everybody in the room has spent as many years talking and thinking about assessment as we all have. So my big question is, why annual assessments? And some sub questions for you guys to dig into under that are, what's the history behind that federal requirement? What role do annual summative assessments play that other tests can't? And what's the appropriate use of the data that comes from them, and what uses are not appropriate? So big, huge question. I know you guys have a ton to say on that, but let's start there to ground the conversation. So Denise, why don't you kick us off for that?
Sounds good. Thank you, Claire, and thanks everybody for joining us this afternoon. At least it's afternoon here in DC. So I'm Denise Forte, Senior Vice President for Partnerships and Engagement with the Education Trust. We are headquartered in DC with offices in New York, Michigan, and California, and we have a presence in about 10 other states. And our work there is about building a movement involving equity partners from across the field, disability advocates, immigration advocates, business leaders, civil rights leaders, educators, parents, to really think through, use research and data to understand what are the inequities out there and how do we challenge them and solve for them. So I'm really excited to be here to talk to you today because of the importance of the conversation that we are having right now around summative assessments, but also let's think, like Claire said, beyond that about what does the future hold. I think just as a baseline, we all need to really, walk ourselves back in history and able to move forward to sort of understand how this all came to pass. And that the facts of the matter were, and sadly to some degree still exist today, we had just communities of schools of Black and brown children for whom English was not their first language, children with disabilities, children from low-income communities that were pretty much invisible in their learning, because for a variety of reasons, people let them fall through the cracks, whether it was a large urban district or a rural district or a suburban district, just not reaching out to understand that perhaps these communities weren't performing on average because they were actually being masked by averages. So in some instances being masked, other instances being lost. And these annual assessments were meant to lift up those communities, to bring up the information that we needed to have to understand how the system was addressing these inequities and how the system could solve for it. They were for both policy leaders, for district leaders, for school leaders, to make sure that they could identify where they might be struggling, where these communities of students might be struggling, and where they might be doing better, and what type of interventions, how could we directly target interventions and supports to make sure that all kids were learning. So that was, one thing we should all get really grounded in. As we look forward, we've seen some progress there. We do now have a greater understanding of why summative assessment, what the role is of summative assessment, but how important they can be to drive system changes. Now, we also have to be really clear, and I don't think any of us around this table, or in fact in this virtual room today, would say that these tests are amazing and can do everything and solve for everything. They are one critical but very necessary piece of data, along with other data that should be used to support students and families in their learning. So I'll stop there, and Chad has much more to offer, I'm sure. We'll just continue the conversation. Thanks again for having me.
Yeah, should I just jump in, Claire?
Yeah, go for it. And particularly on the data use side, what's different about summative assessment? We'd love to hear.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, so like Denise said, thanks everyone for being here. This is a really meaty topic and a very important time. I just have a couple additions to what Denise said. One was the point about summative and the point about the standards-based element to all this. The No Child Left Behind started us off in a push to define, for every state, to define a standard for proficiency for every student, and then to hold every student to the same bar. That was a new concept. It was not being developed across the country. Prior to No Child Left Behind, only about 8 to 10 states had objective tests that measured it for all students. And even for those states, they weren't doing it for all students in all grades. They were doing sampling approaches or grade span testing. And there's a lot of appeal for that going forward. Lots of talk about doing those things this year. There's some pros to that approach, but there's a lot of cons. Denise has already teased out a couple of them. I'll throw out a couple more. One is that if you go to a grade span or a sampling approach, you lose the ability to disaggregate at the school level. So you could still get a sample for a state, and disaggregate for Black students or Hispanic students. But once you get down to the district level, you start to lose some of that because your sample size gets smaller. And once you go to the school level, it becomes almost impossible to get to those, and you lose a lot of ability to look at those different populations. The other thing that we had for summative annual assessments was parental feedback. So it was a way for the federal government to say all parents in these grades should be getting sort of a report card, an objective report card from their state about how their students are performing. And we can talk about whether those are always delivering on what the promise is, but that was the goal, was to have that. And if the federal government did not do that, then there would be more variability. Some districts wouldn't do it at all, wouldn't have a test. Some districts might have a test, but only use it internally and not give the feedback to parents. So that federal government really did have a good backstop there. And the third was school accountability. If we don't have annual assessments, we really struggle with school accountability. And if you think that different schools are adding different values to students, then we really want that ability to look down to the school level. And we might be able to get to a district level or a state level approach with a sampling approach, but it's really, really hard without annual summative assessments. The last thing I'll say is student growth. So it's really hard to measure growth of individual students if you don't test them every year. And we know that things like growth really matters. Both how much students are growing every year is a good predictor for how much the school actually matters, and not just the sort of demographics that a school is able to recruit, but how much value the school is adding to the students' academics. And lots of factors there as well for growth and reasons to include it. I'll pause there, and hopefully that'll tease us up in the second part of the conversation about where we go from here.
Yeah, no, thank you. A great grounding for all of us. So the question we hear a lot, I'm sure the policymakers online, advocates talk a lot about innovations in assessment, the need for change in this current assessment regime. What, in your view, is significant change needed, and what problems with the current regime should we be trying to solve? How would you list out and prioritize the weaknesses that we should be aiming to change, to address? Denise, do you want to start?
Yes, as soon as I find the mic, absolutely. So, absolutely. I mean, to answer the first part of the question, do we need innovation? Absolutely. It is definitely something that is worth exploring. I mean, I think, as Chad brought up, there's some legitimate concerns about testing in school, and I acknowledge, as I said earlier, that the assessments are not perfect, but it is clear that eliminating them entirely will not advance educational equity. And in fact, it will only make it harder to identify how schools are doing and fix those deep-seated inequities in schools. So while they're not perfect, they do remain the best measure we have to identify gaps in student opportunity. At the highest level, our innovation around testing really should be focused on creating higher quality tests that require real world problem solving and provide educators, families, and leaders with more actionable data. Because let us not forget, the role of assessments should be to help us tease out the most critical information along with the other prevailing information that can be used to support the system, so that we know how schools and districts are performing within the state system that is set up. And without some sort of comparable assessment statewide, we really can't get at the heart of what we need to drive system change. Some of the innovations that I like to see are quite narrow, and some are pretty significant. First, everybody, we need to move away from multiple choice sections, to more innovative assessment items. We need to be exploring more about writing, using more robust reading passages and content, using technology in more innovative ways. We need to make these assessments way more culturally inclusive, not only making them available in students' native languages, but also making sure that along with making the assessment more culturally inclusive, that the content that they are using to support is also culturally inclusive and makes the student aware of the experience both where they reside and externally. And then obviously when we are talking about assessments, we have to also be thinking about high quality instruction and curriculum and how any type of innovation is going to support instruction and support curriculum professional development. And we all can agree that there is a need for tighter integration of learning and assessments. And then, probably I don't want to say this is lowest on the totem pole, it's actually quite up there. We need to keep working to get the results to educators, policymakers quicker. And maybe that's how we start exploring how artificial intelligence can be used to score assessments faster. Alongside, we've been looking at what through course assessments might look like, assessments given throughout the year that actually provide a summative grade level score at the end of the year. But indeed, I think, if we're looking at innovation, we still have to make sure that some of the guardrails are there, that we are still assuring for comparability. They are still statewide, that we're not looking at something that is district by district, which in the past has been the case, but we are making sure that we have some form of data that will, when disaggregated, be able to tease out where the problems are and also drive towards those system improvements.
Great, thank you. And that's a long, it's a long list. It's a long, important list. So Chad, I'd love for you to respond to that. What are the, how would you prioritize among that list? And then, related to that, are we expecting this one tool to do too much? How are we just putting so much weight on this one thing that's going to crush under the weight of all the things that we need this test to do? And how do you think about that?
Yeah, Denise made a good case for making tests better. What I would make a case for is actually making tests shorter and faster. I think there is a little bit of a tension there between all the things we would like to do on a test and some of the usability functions. And particularly when we think about state tests, we did an analysis of when states were actually releasing their results to the public. And they're giving the tests in April or May, but they're not releasing it to parents or the public until August, September, October. I mean, they're very late. They take months to return. And by that time, it's too late for teachers to do much. They've already planned their lessons for the new school year. For parents, it's like too late for them to do anything if they wanted to put their student in some summer school programs or to address addition or remediation needs or something like that. And so one path forward on innovation would be something that was shorter and quicker and didn't try to be as comprehensive, basically like a check from the state, and it would be a way to give that feedback very quickly. I took the GRE 15 years ago and got my preliminary score seconds after I took it. And then they sent me something in the mail a few weeks later saying what my final score was. They had to confirm it and verify it. But that was, a long time ago, and we can do that now if we wanted to. There's all these verification process checks that we've put in place as states, and I think we could speed up that process quite a bit. The other thing that I would say on the accountability and use side would be introducing more human judgment into decision making. So right now, most accountability systems are very formulaic, and it's percentage based and numeric, and there's a strict cutoff, and that creates incentive structures about where people are exactly. I would like to add more human judgment to that, and to have the British, for example, have an inspection system where they use tests as a way to spotlight areas of attention, but not as formulaic or mathematical triggers that we use here. And so I'm curious and interested in how states could move in that direction as well.
Thanks. And I see a great and timely question from Quentin in the chat. But I want one follow-up, Chad and Denise, you may have thoughts on this as well. If we simplify, some would argue that kind of short check on the system, Chad, that you just imagined, wouldn't that take us back to a multiple choice, low quality world, inevitably low cost, low check, and then does that then lead to some of the arguably destructive effects on teaching and learning because you're just preparing for a multiple choice test? And how would you balance that tension in that approach?
Well, a couple of things. There is absolutely that tension. So I don't want to push that aside. I will say though that if we are cognizant about training kids for the types of tests and skills that they want to learn, that is important. And also if we can sort of de-emphasize I don't want to say high stakes, because honestly, there aren't that many high stakes in the systems. They are high process, and they may trigger some planning processes for schools and needs improvement documents, but the actual stakes for teachers or faculty are not that high. And so to sort of de-emphasize that, I think the human judgment aspect would help remedy some of that issue as well.
Awesome. So question from Quentin that fits nicely in here is, what are the barriers? Like I think particularly if we focus on Denise's kind of Cadillac version of testing, what are the barriers? Do we cost, technology, politics, all of the above? How do you arm a policymaker who's listening to us right now to navigate, to put him or herself out there and say, I want to lean into testing at a time when testing is unpopular? How should we be thinking about those challenges, and what are they, and how can we overcome them?
Well, I think there's no doubt that in my Cadillac version, Cadillacs are expensive, so funding will be a huge obstacle, but no different than any other education challenge, right? Education investment challenge. The fact of the matter is, if you want to have good information, you're going to have a high quality assessment to get to that information. The types of innovations I've mentioned, they are not cheap. And particularly at this time when states are going to be facing steep budget cuts this year and next year, it's hard to imagine that we can do something like this without significant new federal investments. And when you add in the, as you know, Chad mentioned, the human capital piece of it, that is, you're adding not just that, but the training and the PD that has to go into that type of work. And, even though Congress gave states additional room to explore innovation, not a lot of them took the feds up on it, even though it is a small pilot. They didn't receive any additional federal funding for participating. So states were on their own to design these fairly expensive, innovative assessments. And states that did participate, Louisiana, New Hampshire, Georgia, spent between $1 million and $4 million a year to design and implement those assessments. So both the issue around getting a good assessment and scaling it up will be costly. The other obvious challenge will be the politics as we are experiencing right now. It's even hard to say the word assessment, much less innovative assessment. And people tend to have very wide range of ideas in terms of what innovation actually means. So just getting to a place where there's some common understanding of what we want the end result to be. If it's a shorter test, how do we still make it robust in getting the information that we need that is going to be helpful to driving system improvements, helpful to understanding what community needs what in reading or math. So there are a few barriers, and I think based on what we decide as innovation or different examples of innovation, each will come with a different set of barriers.
Great, and I want to, Chad, you can certainly add to that. I want to jump on the question from Holly. Hi, Holly, good to see you. Good to know you're here. On the market aspects of the challenges and innovation. So, Holly's question is, how do we get more innovative players in the assessment market that's currently kind of dominated by some of the big old, a consolidating number of the old guard? And what are the barriers there that could be overcome to get more innovative players there? And then kind of another aspect of the market is, what could states be doing in terms of RFPs to demand more innovative things from vendors, whether they are the existing ones or new ones?
Yeah, I'd say a couple things here. One is, I do think some of the goals that we've articulated are in conflict with each other. And so we'll have to make some decisions about what we value the most. So for innovation, for example, how far are we willing to let vendors or states go in that front? And are we willing to give up things like comparability or predictability, or trying out a test that we don't have those multi-years of trial runs in place? I think that those are real tensions. For example, for my sort of shorter vision that I've laid out, they would be less aligned to the state standards. They would cover less of the materials than the current ones do, and certainly the ones that Denise is articulating. And that's a trade-off that we would have to make as a country, or perhaps as a state, to say whether that's allowed or not. And for innovation, I think you have to be willing to allow some of those trade-offs to be changed in different directions. And we should be cognizant of what those are and do it in sort of pilot fashion rather than going full on to anything.
And what are the, go ahead,
Claire.
You go, Denise.
Oh, I was just going to say, the one thing I would really encourage us not to let go of and to keep very center in these conversations is the very important role that equity plays here in this conversation, and making sure that we continue to set high standards, that we are assessing against those high standards, and making sure, I know the comparable question is challenging, but really, if you're going to look at the state as a system and making sure that our more wealthy, communities are, just because of their property taxes in the zip code, are getting a higher quality education than some of our lower income communities, we need to have a statewide view of that, and to lose the comparability of some statewide comparisons around education improvement would be a real loss, and that would be a setback.
Absolutely. And can you do that? So how do you, Jessica Sutter asked a question about how we, we've mentioned that a current complaint against the current regime is related to it narrowing the curriculum and teachers teaching to the test being a bad thing. We create the kind of tests where teaching to it would be a good thing, and higher order thinking skills, et cetera. Looking at that specific example of something in the realm of a curriculum embedded or performance assessment, which would get at that issue, what are the other challenges there? How do you do that sort of genuine performance assessment while preserving equity, for example, and making sure that that's not just a test that exists in certain districts for certain kids, and that you can do that in a way and still be able to compare performance across a state?
Jessica Sutter with the hard questions, our Ward 6 council member. Hi, Jessica. So I think if we had that question, all of us would be on board immediately. And there's a, it's a wonderful question. And I think this is something we should be testing, right? There's tremendous agreement that we need better tests. So what does that better test look like? Is it more tied to the curriculum and curriculum embedded? Is it, performance based? I think all of us would agree that we would love to have the availability of AP English content for everybody, right? No one disagrees that everybody says, of course you get tested for AP. No one sees any inherent disconnect with that. So it's really when, we're using bad tests to test bad content and not getting good results, and we're confused by all that. So I'm going to throw this, that's just my soapbox, throw this to Chad, who may have better ideas than me.
Well, I don't know about that. I will say the one thing that I don't think has been thought through in the conversation about through course assessments, for example, there's a lot of interest in that, but that actually would mean more teaching to the test, because it would say, here's where kids need to be in November, here's where they need to be in February, here's where they need to be in May. And by having multiple tests along the year, it'd be even more instructive, if that's the positive way to look at it, for teachers about what content students should be learning at various times of the year. But another way to say that would be more sort of dictatorial to tell teachers the scope and sequence of what they should be teaching. To be clear, I'm not opposed to that. I think there is some value from a state level of being very clear about what should be taught, and that's how we got to state standards. I think it is a clear expectation for all kids, but I just think we should go into this conversation eyes wide open, that the sort of idea of through course could actually lead to more of these pushback issues.
What are the states which states are a bit ahead of the game, or that you have your eye on, and who are getting, at least taking a swing at some of these challenges? What kind of excites you across the country? Like Chad, and then Denise. And if anything worries you.
Lots worry me. I'm excited about what NWA is doing. They are experimenting with through course assessments in Nebraska, and I believe some districts in Georgia. And their sort of background as providers of interim and formative assessments and giving feedback to teachers, I think, is a useful background for this type of conversation, to be able to make things usable for people, and giving more feedback in hopefully a helpful, useful, welcomed way along throughout a year is something I'm excited about. If it gets really political at some point, it could cause a pushback. So I'm anxious about that, but mostly I'm positive.
Yeah, I worry about everything like Chad does, and as if there's not enough to worry about in the world today. I think we're very much still in a wait and see posture. The good thing about the pilot is we're able to test a couple things and see what might work and what's just not working, and hopefully we can have more of that and more of these conversations among the stakeholders. I would love, to get more teachers involved in this conversation, to be ready partners, of which there are a lot. And so, but we should be having more of these conversations with them. I would love to have more state board members engaging in these conversations, hopefully taking some of their hats off as, and which is difficult, sure, as constituent representatives, but just more as like part of a learning process of what assessments are for, what kind of information we really need, what are the barriers to, great assessments, great learning in the classroom, hear from the teachers, hear from the leaders, I think that would be a worthwhile conversation as we explore the different types of innovations. I love thinking about what our international partners are doing and, you know, what role assessments are playing and how they're playing out. So we should do more of that too.
On that, is there a particular model that internationally that you think is instructive for us? Chad mentioned the other pattern accountability and the human center, but like a particular testing regime that you think we should be exploring?
I wish I was smarter on this, Claire, but I just think that looking to our international partners, they, you know, when you look at the test scores on TIMSS or PISA, it just demonstrates that we're missing out on something, probably more than just the assessments. But you know, always look to best practices.
Absolutely. And what? How about technology? Have we leveraged? Does the sector leverage technology the way that it's certainly made a lot of progress? You know, a couple of years ago we didn't have online assessments. Now we're talking about whether we should do virtual assessments. I know we probably all of us don't have as great an understanding as we should of how technologically enhanced some of the items are on some of the tests, the existing tests. But what's the future there, Chad? If you kick us off on how technology could be leveraged in the various stages of testing, from item development through the test itself through grading. And then I'll ask why the technology, why we're not using it yet. But let's start there.
Sure. So a couple things. One is this actually is something I'm optimistic about for the current moment, is we might learn something this year because of all the different remote proctoring environments and opportunities to test students in different places. It's a challenge for this year, but for the long run, it will be good for us to practice those skills, to have students in different formats and to be able to test them. Test them online is another one, to be able to get faster information back to the teachers and back to students and their families, I think is something that's useful. I'm also interested in shifting the conversation a little bit from a high stakes assessment to back to its roots. Like, this is a feedback mechanism for those groups that I mentioned. And so we can be less concerned about test security, or it has to be done in this particular week on this particular test. And if we lighten up some of those things, we can go back to this is a feedback for you about how you are doing. And if there are other cheating things going on, like, it's only harming yourself. And to have it framed in that way, I think will be useful going forward. The challenge with some of this will be the materials and testing items that test companies produce. If some of that, if it goes to the point where they're worried about the item that they've carefully crafted with lots of staff time and research and testing into it, then and they're worried about that going out in public, that's not a good environment for us. So we need to shift the conversation to more about how do we go back to assessments as being a tool for people to diagnose where they are and identify what they can improve on going forward.
Denise, any thoughts on the technology piece? I mean, things I've heard in my testing travels. I mean, should we be figuring out a way to leverage technology to reduce the cost of item development, which is the most expensive part of test development? Should we be on the back end? I think one of the greatest cost drivers of, for example, performance assessment is the grading of them. Can we get to a point where machine learning and AI are playing a role in reducing cost, and even understanding of why isn't the market rising to that challenge, and is there what could be done about it? You're on mute. You have to do it once per meeting, and my dog's gonna bark soon, so we can get our bingo cards.
I was saying those were really good questions. I almost wonder sometimes whether it's a supply and demand sort of thing. People have been so willing to take the cheapest thing off of the shelf and not really looked at what technology or given some thought to how technology can play a greater role. And it's certainly, as we look at adaptive testing and some of the other work that NWEA is doing. I'm thinking of another organization that's totally blanking on me in terms of math assessments. But what role technology can play, I do think has been sort of a supply and demand issue that is worth exploring. But I ultimately, again, I think until we get both the users, practitioners, and the policymakers in a room with some of these test developers so that they can hear what are really the high value points for them, whether it is to have teachers that are more receptive to grading the assessment, whether, content matters, whether all those things that I think are sprinkled out there and people talk about, but there's been no real agreement on the value of each. And I think until we can pull people into a room to have those hard conversations, and certainly now is the time, right? We now, and it's an opportune time for us to be investigating what the next 5 years needs to look like, 10 years.
So thanks. And Quentin put another hardball question in the chat, which almost leads to this question of we need state assessments for accountability purposes. Teachers and schools need formative feedback to improve their learning. Are we making a mistake? Your opinion, but also maybe a prediction of the future. Are we making a mistake by trying to combine the two?
Innovative and summative?
Summative, like summative and any sort of formative purpose for learning. Can use for accountability and use for learning coexist within one tool?
Yeah, that's a good. For the most part, people have said no. It would be interesting to see if you could get something closer to the classrooms, something that is curriculum embedded. But again, we'd want to be really mindful about whether we're getting the information at scale or at system scale that we really want to have for this purpose. And I think, going back to the basics of testing, you need to make sure you create the test, that is designed for the purpose, right?
Yeah, the only thing I would say here, I'm not in the weeds on all the technical issues. I will say that one of the promising areas we might look at is the advanced placement program, and it's been a wild success. It's expanded across the country. If you want to talk about testing opt-ins, it's wildly popular in that sense and growing every year. And some of the reasons for that are it has an objective standard, very clear curriculum. It also has high quality written based questions that are evaluated by professional educators, professional teachers. And so there's buy-in from the teachers in those courses as well. And maybe some of the technology things that we're trying are cool and clever, but they're not going to get us to where we want to go. And so I don't know. I don't have a particular stake in that game, and it's more of a judgment. But I do think that there is something to the human aspect of it all and getting buy-in, sort of in the AP model rather than the sort of whiz-bang tech innovation type approach.
And advanced placement was also very quick to turn on their ability to do remote testing this year. They had to revise it, shorten it, but they still were able to do it. Get it on your phone, you click a picture of your answer, and you got your scores too. So,
and Denise, has the AP done a good job on the equity front? I mean, I know it's been an uphill battle in terms of access on the front end, but how do you grade the AP on the equity scorecard?
Well, I mean, when we're thinking about content, I think the thing that is particularly important is the rigor, for which we know that AP is highly rigorous. I mean, we did a report earlier this year that looked at some of the challenges around access, and they've been great to work with in thinking about how we can solve for that, because it's not just in some instances, the availability of a seat in a class, is the availability of the courses in the building, availability of seats in the course in the building, all of that comes into play when we're talking about equity. But they continue to be great working with, and we're looking forward to continuing those conversations about how we really ensure equity for advanced, and not just AP, but advanced coursework in general.
What other bright thing that's super helpful, and what other bright spots, Chad, in your what is Bellwether on the Bellwether front of things? What on the landscape of the country? Which states do you have, or which models of innovation do you have your eye on? Are you tracking as potential proof points for some of these, for better or worse, on some of these ideas, like performance assessment, like through course? Who's doing things that you're tracking, and why?
Yeah, we sort of mentioned some of them already. Yeah. Louisiana. I'm excited about this NWA pilot in Nebraska and Georgia. Some of it comes out of the non-summative assessment world. So I'll mention something from Texas that I saw last spring. They had their assessment ready. They canceled it and waived it, but they still put it out, and they let schools give students a login to take the test for information purposes. And that, to me, goes back to the heart of why we have assessments, of giving feedback to people who want it, and as a check against everything else that they're getting. So I think that is something I would like to see more of. So if states had some sort of simple, if they went my direction as opposed to Denise's direction on the shorter versus better, more rigorous path, one thing they could do would be to create sort of an online open access test. And again, since you're not worried about cheating, they could populate it and give a score for feedback purposes, not for anything else. And so I'm interested in states that see that as a role as well.
Great. I'm gonna leave time at the end for potentially unfair actual predictions from you guys, which you can absolutely take the fifth on. We'd missed earlier a question from Neil Ruddick on the inspection system. My old friend Neil Ruddick. Hello, Neil. Chad, I think you have thought through a little bit of the dynamics of the inspection system, but how do you think through some of the politics, some of the culture wars in the U.S.? Do people lawyer up? I don't know if I've ever heard you talk about that sort of cultural, political element of it, putting maybe the operational side to the side for a moment.
Yeah, I wrote a paper on this for Bellwether. I can't remember the title, but I can send it if anyone's interested. It was contemplating how this might work. It was right around when ESSA, so it was sort of a proposal for states. It doesn't fit neatly with ESSA, but I still think there might be some workarounds that could get there. One is just the financial possibility of using the 1003 7% set aside money to fund the school inspection system. And there's a couple reasons for that. One would be it creates, right now schools have to write their own needs improvement plan, and the quality of those varies. They don't have a template, they don't have the staff to write those. If we had an inspection system that would go in and write a standardized 5 to 10 page report about diagnosing what the school is strong on, what they're not as strong on, what they need to work on, and having some objective data, some assessments, some interviews of faculty and staff and parents, I think would be a way to get some buy-in. To your question about political buy-in, I think it's by having a respected entity that's not subject to politics. So having them report to the governor as opposed to the chief school officer in a state or something like that, as a way to keep them separate, almost as like a GAO or a auditor or something like that, that is less tied to within the existing system. And then you staff it with competent former school leaders. At least that's how you start. There are people out there retired who might be willing to give their time and expertise, and with a well-run leader at the top of it, and those people out there in schools, a lot of those people already work in this role, but giving them that as their actual job function and title, and having some money behind it, I think is sort of my vision for how it might work here in the US.
Is it done anywhere in the US? Anything like it?
Yeah, the closest parallel would be charter management organizations that they do have their own school. They're not called school inspections, but they have school review quality monitoring, so that to earn, say, the brand of KIP on your school, you still have to meet some benchmarks, and the KIP National then goes and sees all of the KIP schools to make sure they're doing a good job, and sort of monitoring them over time. So there are other CMOs that do that, and that's sort of the closest parallel I've seen in the US. There are other entities that are offering inspection-like services for schools, and those are often in the school improvement space, but they haven't been embedded into a formal system like I've been proposing.
All right, thanks. Well, please throw, we're getting towards time. Please throw any last questions into the chat. A question, I'm not throwing this at you guys. I wasn't holding this back from you guys. So if it's not appropriate for you to answer, you don't feel comfortable, you certainly don't have to. But we're heading into a new administration that is an interesting one for the future of statewide assessments. If you feel comfortable with a very political question, what's your prediction on what a Biden administration specifically means for testing? What kind of pressures, for better or worse, will be on the system? Chad, can I throw it to you first?
Sure. I will say I don't have any particular political insights, so I can't.
That's okay. No, this is based on that. This is you speaking as not on behalf of your organizations, just wild predictions based on nothing.
Yeah, I mean, I hope we have some. I hope we have some form of assessments in spring 2021. I think we really need the information, need the data, and particularly at the student level. I think some of the predictions and projections are important and useful to engage policymakers and the general public about the COVID learning losses. I think we need actual student level information at some point, and parents need that to know where their students are. Teachers need that to know where their students are. So I hope we have that in some fashion, but that means we're going to have to be quite a bit more flexible on what that looks like. So California cut their test in half for 2021, and I hope other states are thinking creatively about whether they can shorten the time, whether they can deliver remotely, other things like that. And then we haven't talked much about accountability, but the Trump administration actually quietly released a template for states to waive or modify much of their school accountability systems for this year. And that seemed like a very sane framework to me of basically telling the states they should have some objective information, but leaving it up to states about what they do with it and how they're going to tweak it this year, or both for temporary purposes and for longer term purposes. That sort of keeping the first principles in mind, but letting states have flexibility, I think, is the right approach.
So I'm hopeful, but not, or maybe I'm, but concerned. I really hope that we don't take our foot off the pedal around one of our key measures for determining how students and schools and the system is responding. I think that would be a big mistake and very unfortunate. Just rolling back, we do have bits of progress in our public school system, both in charters and in traditional, and we want to encourage that progress. Again, we know these assessments are not a cure-all, but when taken, they are currently the only way we can get a view on the system. And with the loss of NAEP this year, we certainly hope that we can continue to see statewide assessments. I think our greatest concern right now, though, should be for those states who, really don't want to move forward, have not made any plans, have not thought about what a spring assessment would look like. That is very problematic. As advocates for students, as advocates for families, for advocates for a high quality public education system, we have to keep pressing forward on the need for better data, for better reporting, for disaggregated reporting, for transparency. That is the only way that we can ensure progress and improvement and work towards improvement for the system. I think without it, we've sort of given up the ghost, and I think that would be just such a tremendous disservice to our children today.
That's a perfect note to end on. We're glad you and your colleagues have your eye on the ball. Denise, Chad, and Denise, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom on a tough topic. Can't wait to see what's ahead for testing, and glad that your brains will be on it. ExcelinEd, well, folks who came, thank you. We enjoyed, and thanks for the questions, even the hardball ones, and thanks to ExcelinEd for hosting quite an event. It's quite an undertaking what you all have pulled off. So thrilled to be a part of it, and we hope we held our own. Thanks so much, all.
Thanks, Claire.